Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Isaac's laughter used to fill the house like a brass band, loud and certain, echoing off the walls of their modest two-bedroom flat in Benin City. Martha could remember those early years with a kind of painful nostalgia, when they were still young, still running on dreams and promises. The smell of roasted corn from street vendors used to drift through their window, and she would sit by the wooden table watching Isaac count his earnings from the small electronics shop he started on Mission Road. Back then, he would look up every now and then and say, "Martha, this city will hear my name soon." His words had rhythm, and she believed them, heart and soul. He worked like a man possessed, leaving the house before dawn and returning late, smelling of sweat and diesel and dust. At first, she admired his drive. It was the fire that lifted them from scarcity to comfort. But success is a strange visitor. It changes the temperature of a home. As Isaac's business grew, something in his voice changed too. He began to speak less to Martha and more to the mirror. His phone buzzed endlessly, and when she asked who it was, he would wave her away, saying, "Business." The tone of that word became his shield. The laughter that once danced between them turned to dry conversation about meals, bills, and silence. He started wearing imported perfumes and talking about people she didn't know. One night, when she reminded him about Daniel's school fees, he sighed impatiently and muttered, "You always find a way to kill my mood." That night, Martha lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, its blades slicing the air like time cutting through their years together. The noise from passing motorcycles mixed with her thoughts that had no place to rest. She told herself things would return to normal, but the city had already claimed her husband. Benin had swallowed him, and all she could do was watch him disappear into its glittering streets. By the time Isaac's second shop opened along Sapil Road, he had already learned the art of forgetting. He forgot the long days Martha stood in the sun, helping him sell cables and bulbs. He forgot how she borrowed money from her sister when the business nearly failed. Success had washed his memory clean. He began to move through life like a man rehearsing for something grander. Parties, handshakes, flattery. Martha watched the transformation happen in slow motion. He stopped coming home for dinner, and when he did, he reeked of alcohol and perfume that wasn't hers. He would drop a few naira notes on the table and head straight to bed without a glance. She wanted to confront him, but fear lived in her chest. She was afraid that naming his sins would make them real. One Sunday, she sat alone in church, praying quietly for her marriage while other women danced with joy. "God," she whispered, "if pride has blinded him, open his eyes before it's too late." But the heavens stayed quiet, and Isaac stayed gone. He bought a new car, hired new workers, and started keeping company with a young woman named Stella, a name Martha heard only through whispers in the market. The world outside saw a successful man. Only Martha knew the emptiness behind that polished smile. Sometimes at night, she'd step out to the balcony and watch the city lights twinkle like mockery. Each light reminded her that somewhere out there, Isaac was laughing, a laugh she used to own. When their son Daniel asked her why Papa was always away, she told him gently, "He's working hard for us." But even as she said it, she felt the lie crumble inside her mouth. Isaac's transformation wasn't sudden, it crept in like rust. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he'd look at Martha and seem almost human again. He'd bring home something small, a necklace, a piece of cloth, and she'd let herself believe he still cared. But it never lasted. His words carried a new arrogance, the kind that made people around him shrink. He'd boast to friends about how he built everything from scratch, never once mentioning the woman who patched his torn shirts when he had none to spare. In the neighborhood, women whispered that Martha was lucky to have such a man. "At least he provides," they'd say. But they didn't know how the nights stretched endlessly, how the silence between them felt heavier than hunger. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection in the mirror and hardly recognize herself, eyes tired, voice small, spirit dimming. The children tiptoed around their father, afraid to breathe too loudly. Ruth, their daughter, once spilled water on his phone and received a slap, so sharp it left a mark for days. That night, Martha held her in the dark, whispering, "Don't cry, my child. Your father wasn't always this way." But the words felt hollow even to her. She began to understand that love, when starved, turns into quiet endurance. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed with footsteps and sighs. Outside, the city moved on, buses honking, generators humming, traders shouting. But inside, their home was an island of silence floating in a sea of noise. One evening, as the Harmattan breeze swept through Benin, Martha stood at the window watching Isaac drive away again. His car disappeared into the blur of headlights, leaving behind a trail of dust and heartbreak. She turned to the children, who sat quietly doing their homework on the dining table, their pencils scratching faintly like insects in the night. She wanted to tell them stories about better days, about how their father once carried her on his back during a flood, about how he once promised to build her the finest kitchen in the city. But those memories now felt like scenes from another lifetime. When she finally turned off the lights and lay in bed, the emptiness beside her was louder than any sound. Isaac didn't return that night, nor the next. She stopped asking questions. When neighbors came around with gossip, she smiled politely and said, "He's fine." Her calmness confused them. But inside, something in her was dying, not quickly, but the way a candle dies, slowly, painfully, one flicker at a time. On the third night, she sat alone in the living room, the power out as usual, a kerosene lamp glowing weakly beside her. She traced the shadow of her hand on the wall and whispered, "Maybe this is how love ends, not with a fight, but with silence." Somewhere across the city, Isaac was at a party, laughter spilling from his lips like spilled wine, unaware that the home he'd abandoned was turning into a graveyard of forgotten promises. The days began to merge into one another like paint bleeding on wet paper, each one carrying the same dull ache of repetition. Martha woke before dawn every morning, sweeping the compound while the sky was still bruised with darkness. The street vendors at the corner of their road would already be shouting, "Bread! Akra!" their voices slicing through the mist like restless birds. She would pause sometimes, broom in hand, staring down the road as if expecting Isaac's car to reappear from the shadows. But he rarely came home anymore. His world had shifted to the upper streets of Benin, where lights never went out and music throbbed all night. When he did come home, it was with the arrogance of a guest, not the warmth of a husband. He'd move around the house with the careless ease of a man who had forgotten that this space once belonged to love. Martha spoke less. She had learned that silence was safer than confrontation. Words between them had turned into weapons. Every sentence seemed to end with a wound. Sometimes she'd stand in front of the mirror after her bath and study the woman staring back at her, her skin dull from worry, her eyes carrying the heavy dust of sleepless nights. She could hardly recognize herself anymore. She had once been full of laughter, but now even her smile felt borrowed. The city outside roared with life, but inside that flat, time stood still, mocking her. There were moments she'd reach out to touch the spot beside her on the bed, and find only the cool imprint of emptiness. She wondered if Isaac ever thought of her when the city lights touched his face. Perhaps he did once. But whatever tenderness existed had been drowned by noise. The noise of money, of flattery, of other women who knew how to whisper his name the way he wanted to hear it. The neighbors still greeted her respectfully, though their eyes told stories their mouths couldn't. They pitied her but admired her strength, not realizing that endurance was not strength. It was just survival wearing perfume. Stella entered Isaac's life like perfume, sweet at first, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. She was younger, vibrant, full of that kind of dangerous confidence that made older men feel reborn. Isaac met her through a business associate, and from that day, his world spun differently. She laughed at his jokes, even the dull ones, and touched his arm with a familiarity that fed his ego. He started taking her to restaurants at GRA, where he'd never once taken Martha. Her laughter filled the space between them, making him feel like a man who had conquered life. He bought her things without blinking, a new iPhone, jewelry, wigs that shimmered like sunlight on water. In return, she gave him attention, and that was all he needed to believe he mattered again. Back home, Martha noticed the new shirts, the expensive shoes, the faint traces of another woman's perfume clinging to his collar. She stopped asking questions. What was the point? Answers no longer changed behavior. One night, he stumbled into the house drunk, humming a song she didn't recognize, his shirt half open and his eyes glassy. When she tried to help him to bed, he pushed her hand away and slurred, "Leave me, I beg. You wouldn't understand." That was the first time she realized that she had officially become invisible to him. Days later, Isaac began sleeping out more frequently. The children stopped waiting for him at dinner. Daniel grew quiet. Ruth learned to harden her face. Even little Ezra, who had once adored his father, started avoiding questions about him. Martha felt their distance like tiny cuts across her soul. She prayed at night, sometimes silently, sometimes through tears, asking God to remember her house. But prayers, it seemed, bounced off the ceiling and came back as echoes. She could almost hear heaven sighing, as if even God was tired of Isaac's foolishness. Benin City had a rhythm of its own, a rhythm Isaac now danced to with reckless abandon. The city was a restless creature, bars lit with neon colors, music spilling into the streets, laughter mingling with lies. Isaac thrived there. He felt younger in those places, surrounded by faces that didn't remind him of responsibility. People called him boss, offered him drinks, and praised his every word. In Stella's company, he was no longer a husband or father, he was a king. She flattered him, telling him he didn't look his age, that he deserved better than the village woman at home. Those words planted roots in his mind. Pride watered them until they grew into a tree that shaded his sense of reason. When Stella asked for money, he gave it. When she hinted she wanted a small shop of her own, he bought her one. Every time he handed her something, he felt powerful again. He didn't see that he was slowly building his own downfall, brick by brick. Meanwhile, his real home began to crumble quietly. The rent was due, the children's school fees piled up, and Martha's savings ran out. She started selling small items at the roadside, just to keep things afloat. She told no one of her struggles. Each evening, she came home with tired legs and aching back, only to find the house emptier than before. The smell of Isaac's old cologne still lingered in the bedroom, mocking her. Sometimes she'd sit on his side of the bed, close her eyes, and imagine him walking through the door again with his old smile, the one he used to wear before the city swallowed him. But imagination has its limits, and when she opened her eyes, there was only silence waiting for her. It was on one of those weary nights that Martha decided to stop expecting him. She realized that love could not thrive on memory alone. The Isaac she had married was gone, and in his place stood a stranger wearing his face. She poured herself into caring for the children, ensuring they didn't carry her bitterness. She taught Daniel how to help her at the market, braided Ruth's hair before school, and told Ezra bedtime stories even when her heart wasn't in it. The neighbors began to notice how she carried herself, quiet but firm, as if something within her had finally solidified. One of them, a woman named F, told her one day, "You're stronger than you think." Martha smiled faintly but said nothing. Strength, to her, was just what remained when hope had packed its bags. Isaac's visits became rare, almost ceremonial. He'd come once in a while, drop money on the table, avoid eye contact, and leave as quickly as he arrived. Each time, Martha felt the distance grow wider. She didn't chase him anymore. She had learned that some men only return when the world has taught them humility. She just prayed quietly that if that day ever came, her heart would still have room to forgive him. Nights in Benin can be cruel, the air thick with humidity, the sounds of generators buzzing like distant grief. In those moments, when the city finally went quiet, Martha would whisper into the darkness, "Lord, I'm tired." And though no one answered, she found strange comfort in the silence. It was the only thing Isaac hadn't yet taken from her. When Isaac's fortune began to unravel, it happened so quietly that even he didn't notice at first. It started with a delayed shipment, then a deal that fell through, and before long, one of his shops in New Benin caught fire in the middle of the night. He stood before the blackened remains the next morning, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt plastic. The neighbors gathered, whispering, "God don catch him," though none dared say it aloud. Isaac's hands trembled as he picked up a half-melted remote control, the irony burning deeper than the flames. He had been the man who thought he could control everything, money, women, time itself. But now, standing in the ashes, he realized control was just an illusion sold to fools like him. Stella had stopped calling as often, her tone colder each day. She claimed her phone was acting up, but Isaac knew what that meant. The men who once toasted to his success at bars now avoided his eyes in public. Even the mechanic he overpaid stopped greeting him respectfully. Benin City, which once bent to his pride, now moved around him indifferently. At night, he drove aimlessly through the streets, trying to find the old thrill, the laughter, the admiration, but all he found was noise. The city was too alive for a man whose soul was dying. He would park by the roadside near Ring Road, watching the streetlights flicker on puddles like scattered coins. Once, he saw Martha walking with Ruth, both of them carrying small bags from the market. They didn't see him. He lowered his head and waited until they passed, shame swallowing his breath. In that moment, he realized that the only people who had truly belonged to him were the ones he had treated like strangers. Weeks turned into months, and the cracks in Isaac's empire deepened. His landlord at the warehouse refused to renew the lease because of unpaid rent. The banks began to call, their voices firm but polite, the way people talk to men they know are sinking. Isaac pretended not to care, but inside, fear crawled across his chest like an insect. He tried borrowing money from old friends, but they all gave the same excuse. Things are tight. He even went to see Stella, but she had moved out of her apartment, leaving no forwarding address. For days, he sat in his car outside her old building, staring at the closed windows, hoping she might appear. She never did. One night, he drank himself into a stupor and slept in the car till morning. When he woke, his neck stiff, the realization hit him. He was no longer the man Benin City admired. He was just another tired face among millions. Pride still sat heavy in his heart, refusing to let him go home, but hunger and exhaustion were stronger. One Sunday evening, he drove to his old house in Usulu. When Martha opened the door, her eyes widened slightly, not in welcome but in disbelief. He looked smaller, older, his clothes hanging loosely like borrowed skin. "Martha," he said quietly, voice cracking, "can I come in?" She stepped aside, not out of kindness but courtesy. Inside, the house smelled different, cleaner, quieter, like peace that no longer needed his approval. The children stood behind her, watching. Daniel's expression was guarded, Ruth's face unreadable, Ezra hiding half behind his mother's wrapper. Isaac wanted to speak, to say something that might heal the years he had broken, but no words came. He just nodded and sat down, his hands clasped tightly. Martha said nothing, only placed a cup of water on the table, and went back to her chores. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of everything they'd left unsaid. Isaac stayed in the house after that day, though it no longer felt like his. The room seemed to reject him, the walls remembering his absence too clearly. He tried to start conversations with the children, but their answers were short, polite, and distant. Daniel had grown taller, his eyes steady and cold. Ruth rarely looked at him, and Ezra avoided his gaze altogether. Martha treated him with quiet civility, cooking meals but leaving his plate separate. She did not shout or complain. She simply existed beside him as though they were two strangers forced to share a roof. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night and hear her whispering prayers in the next room. Not for him, but for strength to endure him. Each word she spoke was a reminder that he was no longer needed, only tolerated. He thought about the days he had wasted chasing illusions, the nights spent in bars with people who only cared for his wallet. Now he couldn't even afford to buy his own medicine. The sickness had started, a dull ache in his bones, a cough that wouldn't leave. He told himself it was nothing, just stress, but deep down he knew better. His reflection in the mirror scared him. The man staring back looked like a ghost of his former self. He tried to talk to Martha one morning, to tell her he was sorry, but when he saw her eyes, calm, detached, unyielding, his voice broke. "Eat your food before it gets cold," she said flatly, and walked away. That was when he realized forgiveness was not something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, and he had done nothing to deserve it. The sickness worsened with each passing week. Isaac began to spend most of his time on the wooden chair by the window, watching the street. Children played football in the dusty compound, shouting with the kind of joy he no longer understood. Sometimes Ruth would pass him a bowl of soup without a word. Daniel, though distant, helped him to the bathroom on bad days, his strength both humiliating and comforting. Ezra rarely came close, afraid of the smell of sickness that clung to his father's body. Martha's face remained unreadable, though her eyes sometimes betrayed a flicker of pity, a small, reluctant spark buried under years of hurt. One night, as thunder rolled across the city, Isaac struggled to breathe. The power was out, and the heat pressed down like a curse. He called her name softly, but she didn't answer. When he tried again, louder this time, she appeared in the doorway, arms folded. "What is it?" she asked. "Water," he whispered. She looked at him for a long moment before fetching it. Their eyes met briefly as she handed him the cup, and in that fleeting glance, something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not forgiveness, but understanding. As she turned to leave, he said, almost to himself, "I should have loved you better." She paused, then walked away, the sound of her footsteps blending with the rain outside. That night, Isaac lay awake, listening to the storm, realizing that some mistakes echo louder than thunder. Isaac's body weakened faster than he expected, as though all the years of arrogance were finally taking their revenge. The mornings became heavier, the air thicker, every breath a negotiation with pain. He began to measure time not by days, but by the intervals between Martha's footsteps in the hallway. He listened for her movement, for the sound of water being fetched, for the clinking of plates that meant the world outside his sickness still existed. The once strong man who commanded markets and men now struggled to lift a cup of water without spilling it. He sat near the window most days, watching the street life he was no longer part of. The city moved on, relentless and indifferent. Children ran past, their laughter slicing through the air like small, sharp memories of a joy he had long forgotten. Occasionally, a neighbor would wave, and he would raise his hand weakly in return, the gesture both greeting and confession. Martha rarely spoke more than necessary. Her silence was not cruelty, it was weariness turned into language. She did not gloat or scold, but every time she walked past him without meeting his eyes, he felt the weight of all he had broken. The house was neat, too neat, like a place waiting for someone's absence. The smell of disinfectant replaced the old warmth of food and perfume. Even the children's voices were subdued, carrying the politeness that pain teaches too early. Isaac began to notice how his world had shrunk to a few square meters, the bed, the window, the chair, and the slow ticking of the clock. He often wondered if Martha prayed for him at night, or if her prayers had shifted elsewhere, to peace, to freedom, to something that did not include him. The sickness pressed harder each day, and the loneliness became its own disease. He wished he could rewind life, return to that small flat on Mission Road where laughter was still possible. But life doesn't give second screenings of the same movie. Once the reel burns, it's gone. There were days when regret felt heavier than fever. He would close his eyes and see flashes of his past, Martha's smile on their wedding day, the children running barefoot in the compound, the way she used to wait for him at the window every evening. Those memories came like visitors he hadn't paid enough attention to when they were alive. He realized then that success had blinded him worse than sickness ever could. Money had been his god, and pride his preacher. The people he once entertained in bars and hotels had all vanished. No phone calls, no visits, no sympathy. Benin City's charm was cruel that way. When your pockets dry up, even the wind forgets your name. He sometimes tried to start a conversation with Martha, but the words came out awkward, fragile, half-formed. "You've done well with the children," he said once, his voice thin as thread. She didn't respond, only adjusted the curtain so the sunlight wouldn't fall on his face. He felt the sting of her silence more than any insult. He couldn't blame her. He had spent years teaching her not to trust his words. One night, he dreamt of Stella. She was laughing, calling his name, her face shifting into smoke. When he woke, Martha was standing by the door, her back turned to him, folding clothes. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had neglected, but as the survivor of a storm he had created. Her movements were calm, precise, purposeful, the movements of someone who had long stopped expecting kindness. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry, but the words stayed trapped behind his teeth, trembling like a confession afraid of rejection. When she left the room, he whispered it anyway, not expecting her to hear. "I'm sorry, Martha," he said. The walls absorbed his voice. That night, he cried quietly, his tears mixing with sweat, his heart folding under the weight of remorse. As Isaac's condition worsened, the house began to smell faintly of medicine and unspoken truths. The children learned to move around him gently, as though any sound might break him further. Ruth, now older and more reserved, brought him food and adjusted his pillows without expression. Daniel did the hard chores, fixing the leaking pipe, fetching drugs from the pharmacy. Even Ezra, who barely understood the complexities of adulthood, seemed to sense that something irreversible had entered their lives. Martha watched her children grow into responsibility too early, and it filled her with both pride and sorrow. She had taught them to be resilient, but she hadn't wanted them to learn it through pain. Sometimes she caught Isaac watching them with tears in his eyes, and she wondered what kind of thoughts haunted him. The nights were the hardest. When the city slept and the hum of generators died, every creak of the house sounded like a ghost from their past. Martha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing from the next room. She wanted to forgive him, but forgiveness felt like handing back a stolen heart. Each time she almost softened, the memory of her loneliness rose like a wall. One evening, while preparing soup, she heard him cough violently and hurried to his room. He sat bent over, gasping for air, his face pale and damp. For a moment, instinct overpowered resentment. She held his shoulders until his breathing steadied. When he looked up, his eyes were glassy with gratitude and shame. "Thank you," he managed to whisper. She didn't respond. She simply stood, wiped her hands on her wrapper, and left. Yet as she returned to the kitchen, her heart thudded differently. Something inside her, perhaps the old love or just mercy, had stirred again, even if she wouldn't admit it aloud. The evening that changed everything came quietly, like most turning points do. The rain had been falling all day, steady and cold, washing the streets of Benin with the smell of wet dust. Isaac sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, his breath coming slower now. Martha was in the next room folding the children's clothes when she heard him call her name. Not weakly, not as a plea, but as if it carried the weight of every apology he'd never voiced. She walked in and found him staring at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "Martha," he said, "I don't know how much time I have left, but I need you to know that everything I chased out there meant nothing." His voice cracked mid-sentence, his chest heaving. She stood still, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't need to say anything," she murmured, almost to herself. But he kept speaking, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "I was proud. I was foolish. And if there's still space in your heart, I'm begging for forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because I can't leave without trying." The room felt heavier, the air dense with decades of pain. Martha swallowed hard. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she sat beside him, her body rigid, eyes glistening. "You broke me, Isaac," she said softly. "You turned our home into a desert. I don't know if forgiveness is something I can give, but I'll not let hate bury me beside you." He nodded slowly, tears sliding down his cheeks. When she stood to leave, she turned once more and whispered, "Rest now." The rain outside softened to a drizzle, and for the first time in years, the house felt like it could breathe again. Isaac leaned back in the chair, exhausted but strangely peaceful. For the first time, he understood that love, even when wounded, was the only thing that ever truly remained. The days that followed Isaac's confession carried a strange quietness, the kind that felt too heavy to be peace, yet too soft to be sorrow. The rain that once filled the gutters with noise had stopped, leaving behind streets glistening under the pale morning light. Martha woke before everyone else, as usual, but her movements had slowed. Every step seemed weighed down by thoughts she couldn't name. Isaac slept more now, his breath shallow, his presence a fading echo in the rooms they once shared. The children had learned to speak in whispers around him, as though their voices might disturb his fragile connection to life. There was something unsettling about how death makes people gentle. Even Daniel, who had carried anger like a badge, began to soften. He would come home early from work to help his mother lift his father, or to adjust the mosquito net. Sometimes he just stood quietly by the window, watching his father sleep, his face unreadable. Ruth cooked meals she knew he couldn't finish, while Ezra would slip into his father's room to watch him breathe, a child's silent curiosity masking fear. Martha noticed these things, but said nothing. She had stopped trying to explain the world to her children. Some lessons were too heavy for words. At night, when she sat outside alone, she found herself listening to the city in a new way. The distant rumble of traffic, the laughter of neighbors, the clinking of bottles in the next compound. Life was moving, unstoppable, indifferent. Sometimes she envied its pace. She wanted to ask God why love often came with so much pain, but even that question felt tired. Instead, she sat under the fading moonlight, fingers clasped around her knees, and whispered softly, "Help me finish well." Isaac's mind drifted in and out of sleep, but when he was awake, his thoughts were sharper than ever. Regret had a way of clearing the fog of pride. He spent hours replaying his past in painful fragments. The night he first struck Ruth, the morning he humiliated Martha for asking for money, the countless evenings he chose strangers over his family. Each memory returned like a debt collector at the door, demanding attention. He realized that for all his wealth, he had lived a bankrupt life. He had built walls instead of bridges, gathered noise instead of peace. There were moments when he tried to pray, but his voice always cracked midway, not out of weakness, but because the words came too late. He often thought of Stella, not with longing, but with bitterness at himself. She had been a mirror reflecting his vanity back at him, and he had mistaken that reflection for love. If he could see her again, he would tell her that emptiness was perfume too. But he no longer had the strength or desire to chase ghosts. His world had shrunk to the sound of Martha's footsteps and the rhythm of his own faltering heartbeat. Sometimes she caught him watching her with a look that frightened her, not because it was angry or proud, but because it was filled with quiet surrender. It was the look of a man who had finally made peace with his insignificance. One afternoon, when she brought him his medicine, he said, "You've been good to me, Martha, even when I gave you no reason to be." She didn't answer. Words like that arrived too late, like rain on a grave. But later that night, she found herself crying without knowing exactly why. Perhaps because mercy always leaves a wound even as it heals. The house took on a rhythm of waiting. waiting for breath, for silence, for the next morning. Each tick of the wall clock sounded louder than usual. Isaac's breathing became unpredictable, steady one moment, strained the next. The children lived as though walking on the edge of something inevitable. Martha found herself praying again, not for a miracle, but for gentleness when the end came. She still cooked his meals, though he barely ate, still washed his clothes, though he barely wore them. Sometimes she would stand outside his room and listen to him murmur in his sleep, calling names that made no sense. Once she heard him whisper her name followed by a soft, broken thank you, and it unsettled her for days. She wondered what forgiveness truly meant, whether it was something spoken or something lived. She began to see Isaac as a story rather than a man, a caution wrapped in flesh, a once bright flame that had learned humility only through ashes. Neighbors came sometimes, bringing fruit or offering short prayers. They'd leave whispering, pity etched into their faces. Martha ignored them. Pity was another form of gossip, and she wanted neither. What she wanted, though she wouldn't admit it aloud, was closure. A clean ending. A day when she could breathe without waiting for coughs from the next room. The city outside carried on, buses honking, traders haggling, lovers laughing, while inside that small house, time moved differently. Every minute stretched, heavy and fragile. In the silence, Martha realized that grief doesn't always start when someone dies. Sometimes it begins while they're still breathing beside you. The morning Isaac slipped away was unremarkable at first. The sky was pale, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Martha woke before dawn and went about her chores, sweeping the compound, boiling water, packing the children's lunches. When she went to check on him, he was lying still, his face turned toward the window. For a moment, she thought he was asleep, but something about the stillness made her pause. She moved closer, her heart steady but slow, and placed her hand on his chest. There was no movement. No rise, no fall. Just silence, deep, endless, final. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply sat beside the bed, her hand still resting on his body, her mind blank. The children woke to the sound of her soft humming, a song she used to sing when they were little. When they entered the room, they understood without words. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. Ruth knelt beside the bed, pressing her palm to her father's cold hand. Ezra hid behind the doorway, his face buried in his arm. Martha remained silent. She had thought this moment would bring relief, but instead, it brought an ache that words couldn't hold. She realized that even after all the pain, part of her had still hoped for more time. One more morning, one more chance to hear him breathe. Outside, the sky finally broke open, rain pouring down in slow, deliberate sheets. She stood, walked to the window, and whispered, "Rest now, Isaac." The rain answered her, tapping softly against the glass like an old friend offering comfort. And in that quiet, she understood something she had never known before, that love doesn't disappear when it is betrayed. It simply changes shape, becoming something that can endure even death itself. The day after Isaac's burial, the house smelled faintly of candle wax, wet earth, and palm leaves. The mourners had gone, leaving behind the kind of silence that doesn't just fill rooms but seeps into the bones. Martha stood by the window where Isaac used to sit, her arms folded loosely, her eyes tracing the road beyond the gate. The city, in its indifference, had already swallowed the news of his death. People who had once known him returned to their routines. His name became a whisper, a small rumor passing through the market, then fading like dust in the evening wind. Martha watched as the rain clouds broke apart, revealing a pale sky that looked too calm for what she felt inside. She didn't cry at the funeral, nor did she cry that morning. Her grief wasn't the loud kind, it was the quiet ache that pressed on her heart like a sleeping weight. She remembered how he had once promised her the world, how he had made her laugh so hard she cried, how he had made her cry so hard she forgot how to laugh. Now, standing in the same house where it all began, she felt something shift within her. Not forgiveness exactly, not bitterness either, but a tired acceptance. Life had happened, and it had taken its price. The children moved about the house quietly, each processing loss in their own way. Daniel, the eldest, buried himself in work, refusing to speak about his father. Ruth became thoughtful, her eyes distant, as though she were seeing the world through a different lens. Ezra, still too young to understand the full depth of death, kept asking questions that made Martha's chest tighten. "Mama," he said once, "where is Papa now?" She paused before answering, her voice steady. "He's where there's no more pain, my son." But later that night, as she sat alone under the flickering bulb, she whispered into the darkness, "Is there really such a place?" Weeks passed, and the rhythm of normal life slowly returned, though nothing truly felt normal anymore. Martha found solace in routine, sweeping the compound, washing clothes, cooking meals, as if order could fill the emptiness. The children adjusted, their laughter returning in hesitant fragments. Sometimes she would catch Ruth humming while washing dishes, or Daniel playing quietly with Ezra outside, and those moments warmed her like sunlight after a storm. Yet in the quiet hours of dawn, when everyone else was asleep, Martha would wake and feel the absence beside her like a shadow. She didn't miss Isaac's presence exactly. What she missed was the idea of what they could have been if he hadn't let pride ruin everything. She often thought about the younger version of herself, the woman who had once waited by the window for her husband to come home, who believed that love could fix any wound. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone older, wiser, but lonelier. Still, there were days when the memory of Isaac's voice softened her heart. She'd remember the rare times he laughed with the children, or the day he built the small bench under the mango tree for her to rest while she cooked. Those memories came like gentle waves. They didn't drown her, but they refused to let her forget. The neighbors occasionally visited, offering kind words that sounded rehearsed. He was a good man, they'd say, and Martha would nod, not correcting them. Some truths were too complicated to explain. Instead, she'd serve them tea, smile politely, and wait for them to leave. When the door closed, she'd exhale deeply, feeling lighter in their absence. The city outside continued to hum, buses honking, traders shouting, motorcycles racing past, life moving forward as it always did, indifferent to grief. It was one Saturday morning when Martha decided to visit the cemetery for the first time since the burial. She told the children she was going to the market, not wanting to explain where she was really headed. The path to the cemetery was quiet, lined with jacaranda trees shedding purple petals that fell softly under her feet. When she reached Isaac's grave, the mound of red earth had flattened slightly, and someone, perhaps Daniel, had placed fresh flowers there. She stood for a long moment, staring at the name etched on the wooden cross. The letters seemed to blur, not because of tears, but because of how unreal it all felt. For years, Isaac had seemed indestructible, too proud, too stubborn, too alive to ever fade into memory. And yet here he was, reduced to soil and silence. Martha knelt slowly, brushing some dust off the cross. "You're at peace now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The wind stirred lightly, carrying the scent of rain. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second, she imagined him sitting beside her, healthy again, smiling, saying her name the way he used to when the world was simple. She opened her eyes quickly, shaking the thought away. "You got what you wanted, Isaac," she murmured. "Freedom." She stayed there until the sky began to darken, then stood and walked away, not looking back. But as she walked home, she felt something strange, not sadness exactly, but a quiet calm, as if she had finally laid down a burden she didn't know she was carrying. Back home, the evening air smelled of fried plantain and kerosene. Ruth and Ezra were setting the table, while Daniel sat outside, fixing a broken lantern. Martha watched them through the doorway for a while, her heart swelling with a complicated mix of pride and longing. They had survived, not unscarred, but standing. When she joined them, Ezra ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her waist. "Mama, can we eat now?" he asked, his voice full of innocence. She smiled and nodded, her first genuine smile in months. As they ate, laughter crept back into the room, tentative but real. The light flickered on their faces, making them look like a family reborn. After dinner, Martha stepped outside alone. The sky above Benin glittered faintly with distant stars, the air cool and forgiving. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the city's pulse, the same city that had once taken her husband away and now gave her the strength to move on. Somewhere in the distance, a generator coughed to life, a dog barked, and life continued its endless rhythm. Martha whispered softly into the night, "A river that forgets its source will one day dry." Her words lingered in the air, carried by the wind, fading into the hum of the city. She turned back toward the house, the laughter of her children floating out to meet her. And for the first time in a very long while, she felt no bitterness, no regret, only the quiet, steady certainty that she had survived what was meant to destroy her, and that was enough. My friend, no matter how far life takes you, never forget the people who held your hands when you had nothing. Money fades, beauty ages, but love and kindness echo long after we're gone. Treat your family with tenderness, because when the crowd disappears and the music stops, they're the ones who will still stand by your bedside. Don't wait until pride humbles you. Choose humility early, and peace will never leave your home. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the lesson in this story, a reminder that love is a treasure no riches can replace. Lord, teach us to value those who truly care for us. May pride never blind our eyes, and may greed never harden our hearts. Bless every listener with wisdom to build their homes with patience, understanding, and forgiveness. For those who feel forgotten, comfort them. For those who are hurting, heal them. For every broken family, Lord, restore peace and unity. Let our lives not end in regret, but in grace. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.